Welcome, listeners, to Critical Crime, the podcast that delves into the darkest corners of criminal history. I'm your host, Philly, and today we are about to embark on a bone-chilling journey into one of the most haunting and unsolved murder cases in history, the Hinterkaifect Massacre. Picture this: an isolated farm nestled in the idyllic German countryside. It is the 1920s, a time when innocence was shattered by a sinister act that defied explanation. The Hinterkaifect farm, located in a remote hamlet, became the setting for a nightmarish event that haunts us to this very day. In this episode, we'll peel back the layers of mystery and explore the depths of horror that unfolded within those hollowed walls. We'll dig into the background of the Hinterkaifect farm, a place with a troubled past and an air of eerie isolation. Embrace yourself as we recount the chilling events of March 31st, 1922, when the Gruber family who resided on the farm met a gruesome fate at the hands of an unknown killer. 6 lives were taken, leaving the community in shock and investigators perplexed. Throughout this episode, we'll examine the evidence, sift through the rumors, and attempt to uncover the truth behind this haunting mystery. Join me as we journey into the heart of darkness that is the Hinterkaifect farm, and we confront the lingering questions that have defied resolution for over a century. Get ready for a tale that will send shivers down your spine as we venture into the Hinterkaifect murder case, only on Critical Crime. Jumping into an ad real quick, 5 Star Arrangements is a sportswear company that reminds their customers you're born a star and will always be a star. Even when things are going downhill, the best is yet to come. You can follow them on Instagram at 5 Star Arrangements. Link to their Instagram and website will be in that caption for this video. The murders took place on March 31st, 1922, when the Gruber family and their maid were murdered by an unknown killer. The victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilla, their daughter Victoria Gabrielle, Victoria's 2 children, Kazilla and Joseph, and then the maid, Maria Baumgartner. They were all found killed with an axe. This incident is considered one of Germany's most gruesome and puzzling unsolved murders. Before the incident, the family and their former maid reported hearing strange noises coming from the attic, which caused that maid to quit. This case remains unsolved to this day and will more than likely never be solved. Less than a year after the murders, the farm was demolished. That caused additional evidence to be revealed, including an axe hidden in the attic and a penknife found in the hay inside the farm. There were some strange occurrences in and around Hinterkaifect shortly before the attack. 6 months before the attack, the family maid had quit, like previously mentioned. It has been widely claimed that her reason for leaving was that she had heard strange noises in the attic and believed the house to be haunted. Andreas Gruber found a strange newspaper from Munich on the property in March 1922. He could not remember buying it and initially believed that the postman had lost the newspaper. This was not the case since no one in the area was subscribed to the paper. Just days before the murders, Gruber told neighbors that he had found tracks in the fresh snow that had led from the forest to a broken door lock in the farm's machine room. Later during the night, they heard footsteps in the attic, but Gruber found no one when he searched the building. Although he told several people about his observations, he refused offers of help, and details went unreported to the police. According to a school friend of 7-year-old Kazilla Gabrielle, the young girl reported that her mother Victoria had fled the farm that night before the attack, after an incident and only hours later had been found in the forest. On the afternoon of Friday, March 31st, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the farm after a short stay. She was more than likely the last person to see the victims alive. It appears that in the late evening, Victoria Gabrielle, her 7-year-old daughter, Kazilla, and her parents, Andreas and Kazilla, were lured to the family's barn through a stable, where they were murdered, one at a time. The perpetrators then moved into the living quarters, where with the same murder weapon, they killed Joseph sleeping in his bassinet and Baumgartner in her room. 4 days had passed between the murders and the discovery of the bodies. On April 1st, coffee settlers Hans Shavolsky and Edward Shavolsky arrived in Hinterkaifect to take an order. When no one responded to the door and window knocks, they walked around the yard but found no one. They noticed that the gate to the machine house was open, but then they decided to leave. Kazilla's Gabrielle was absent from school without excuse for the next few days, and the family failed to show up for Sunday worship. Assembler Albert Hofner went to Hinterkaifect on April 4th to repair an engine. He stated that he had not seen any of the family members and had heard nothing but the sounds of the farm animals and the dog inside the barn. After waiting for an hour, he decided to start his repair, which he completed in roughly 4.5 hours. Around 3:30 p.m., Lorenz Schlissenbauer sent his son Johann, age 16, and stepson Joseph, 9, to Hinterkaifect to see if they could contact the family. When they reported that they had not seen anyone, Schlissenbauer headed to the farm that same day with Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. Entering the barn, they had found the bodies of Andreas and his wife Kozilla, Victoria, and young Kozilla. Shortly afterward, they found Maria and the youngest family member Joseph murdered in the house. Initial investigations were hampered by the number of people interacting with the crime scene. People were moving bodies and items around. Some were even cooking and eating meals in the kitchen. The day after discovering the bodies, court physician Johann Baptist Mueller performed autopsies in the barn. It was established that an axe was most likely the murder weapon, although the weapon itself was not found at the scene. Evidence showed that the young Kozilla had been alive for several hours after the assault. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. First suspecting the motive to be robbery, the police interrogated traveling craftsmen, vagrants, and several inhabitants from the surrounding villages. But they abandoned this theory when large amounts of money was found in the house. It was clear that the offender had remained at the farm for several days. Someone had fed the cattle, consumed an entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and had recently cut meat from the pantry. With no clear motive to be understood from this crime scene, the police began creating a list of suspects. Despite repeated arrests, no murder was ever found, and the files were closed in 1955. Here are a few inconsistencies with the case. The inspection record of the court commission, it was noted that the victims were probably drawn to the barn by restlessness in the stable, resulting in the noises from the animals. A later attempt, however, revealed that at least human screams from the barn could not be heard in the living area. On the night after the crime, 3 days before the bodies were discovered, the artisan Michael Plock happened to pass by the home. He saw that the oven had been heated by someone. That person had approached him with a lantern, blighted him, and he hurried along. Plock also noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a strong smell. This incident was not followed up, and no investigation was conducted to determine what had been burned that night in the oven. On April 1st at 3 a.m., the farmer and butcher named Simon was on his way home near Brunnen, where he saw two mysterious figures at the forest edge. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so their faces could not be seen. Later, when he heard of the murders in Hinterkaifect, he thought it was possible that the strangers might be involved. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight, asking him questions about the murder, before shouting that he was the murderer and then running into the woods. The stranger was never identified. With all that information, it's time to introduce the suspects I found to be likely, starting off with Carl Gabriel. Carl Gabriel was the husband of the widowed Victoria Gabriel. In December 1914, during the First World War, he had reportedly been killed by a shell attack in Arras, France, but his body had never been recovered. After the murders, people began to speculate about whether he had died in fact during the war. Victoria conceived and gave birth to her son Joseph in her husband's absence. The boy was rumored to have been a product of incest between Victoria and her father, Andreas, which was documented in court and known in the village. Andreas was found to be R-wording his daughter, and the town convicted them both of incest. After the end of the Second World War, war captives from the Schrobenhausen region were released prematurely from Soviet captivity, claiming that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer, who claimed to be the Hinterkaifect murderer. However, some of the men later revised their statements, which diminishes their credibility. Many theorized that the Soviet officer in question might have been Carl Gabriel, because those who claimed to have seen Gabriel after his reported death testified that he wanted to go to Russia. Our next suspect is Lorenz Schlissenbauer. Shortly after his first wife's death in 1918, Lorenz Schlissenbauer was believed to have had a relationship with Victoria Gabriel and father Joseph. Schlissenbauer came under suspicion by locals early in the investigation because of his several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the bodies. When Schlissenbauer and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all the other doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Schlissenbauer apparently unlocked the front door with a key, suspiciously, I may add, and entered the house alone. A key to the house had gone missing several days before the murders, though it is also possible that Schlissenbauer, as a neighbor or as Victoria's potential lover, might have been given a key. When asked why he had went into the house alone when it was unclear if the murderer might still be there, Schlissenbauer allegedly stated that he went to look for his son Joseph. It is known that Schlissenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For years after, local suspicion remained on Schlissenbauer because of his strange comments which indicated knowledge of details only the killer would recall. According to his information and the files for the case, a local teacher, Hans Blager, discovered Schlissenbauer visiting the remains of a demolished Hinterkaifect in 1925. When asked why he was there, Schlissenbauer stated that the frozen ground hindered the perpetrator's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn. This was seen as evidence that Schlissenbauer had intimate knowledge of the ground conditions at the time of the murders. Although being a neighbor and familiar with the local land, he may have been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Schlissenbauer murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Joseph. Before he died in 1941, Schlissenbauer conducted and won several civil claims for slander against persons who described him as the murderer of Hinterkaifect. A third suspect, or suspects as I shall say, is the Gump brothers. Adolf Gump was listed as a suspect as early as April 9th due to his connections to the Freikorps Oberland. In 1951, prosecutor Andreas Popp investigated his brothers Adolf and Anton Gump concerning the murders at Hinterkaifect. Their sister claimed on her deathbed that Adolf and Anton had committed the murders. As a result, Anton Gump was remanded to the police custody, but Adolf had already died in 1944. After a short time, Anton was dismissed again, and in 1954, the case against him was finally discontinued because he could not have been proven to have participated in the crime. Our fourth batch of suspects is George Siegel and the Bichler brothers. It is reported that the former maid suspected the brothers, Anton and Carl Bichler, to have committed the murders. Anton Bichler had helped fire the potato at Hinterkaifect, and therefore he knew the premises. Rieger, the former maid, said Bichler talked to her often about the Gruber and Gabriel family. Anton reportedly suggested that the family ought to be dead. The maid also emphasized in her interrogation that the farm dog, who barked at everyone, never barked at Anton. She also reported speaking with a stranger through her window at night. The maid believed that it was Carl Bichler, the brother of Anton. She thought that Anton and Carl Bichler could have committed the murders with George Siegel, who had worked at Hinterkaifect and he knew the family's fortune. Supposedly, Siegel had broken into the home in November 1920 and stolen several items, though he denied. He did state that he had carved the handle of the murder weapon when he was working at Hinterkaifect, and he knew that the tool would have been kept in the barn passage. Our next batch of suspects is the Thaler brothers. According to a statement made by the former maid, the Thaler brothers were also suspected. The brothers had already committed several minor burglaries before the crime. Rieger said that Joseph Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, but she never gave an answer. In conversation, Joseph Thaler claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. During the conversation, Rieger noted that there was another person nearby. According to her statement, Joseph Thaler and the stranger looked at the machine house and turned their eyes upwards. Our last suspect is Paul Mueller. In his book, The Man from the Train, author Bill James alleges that a man known as Paul Mueller may have been responsible for the murders. Mueller was the only suspect in the 1987 murder of a Massachusetts family, and James believes Mueller killed dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. The Hinterkaifeck murders in fact bear some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes in the United States, including the slaughter of an entire family in their isolated home, the use of a blunt object used as a weapon such as a pickaxe, moving and stacking bodies of victims, and the apparent absence of robbery as a motive. James suspected that Mueller, described as a German immigrant by the media, might have left the United States for his homeland around 1912 after private investigators and journalists noticed and publicized patterns in family murders across state lines. With that being said, that brings us to the end of our suspect list. To be honest, for us to guess who was really the killer, I would have to say it was either Lorenz Schlissenbauer, because I can't lie, he just sounded too suspicious, because what if the reason he killed them was because he thought Joseph was his child, and then he really found out that it was the product of incestation, so he decided that he needed to get his revenge because he loved the boy so much, so he decided to kill the whole family. What if that was the reason that happened? But then it also could have been that serial killer, because I'll be honest, the serial killer theory does sound pretty good because, like, he's done this before. He is from Germany, and he's done this in the United States plenty of times. I would not be surprised if it was one of them. But then the theory that the maid was saying it just doesn't make sense because, to be honest, I think the maid also could have something to do with it because even though it's reported that she left because she thought the house was haunted, who's to say that she didn't really leave because she has something else planned? And then she keeps saying how someone came to her window and she doesn't really know who it was. It's like she's just trying to distract people from what really could have happened. But yeah, the Lorenz Schlissenbauer theory also, it does make some sense because it could have been because of a grudge. And he did know some intimate details, like was said, but like he also was a farmer and he lived in the area. So I wouldn't be surprised if what he said was just known by everybody there. But as you guys already know, this crime is unsolved. And that's all she wrote for today's episode of Critical Crime. Join us next time as we continue pursuing justice and unraveling more perplexing cases. Remember, true crime may send shivers down your spine, but knowledge is our greatest weapon. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'd like to say thank you for tuning in this week on Critical Crime. Keep an eye out for that giveaway for a shirt, a jacket, and $200. Information of the giveaway will be on our Instagram at Critical Crime 1. Don't forget to stay vigilant, and until next week on Critical Crime.